Welcome to Tomo-Kahni State Historic Park. My name is Ernie Lawson. I'm a State Parks volunteer and I will be conducting the tour this morning. This is an ancient village site and there were people in the local community that felt that it should be preserved for future generations. Members of the Heritage League, with the assistance of Phil Wyman, then Assemblyman, proposed legislation to get funds in order to purchase this site, and they were successful in 1994, and it was incorporated into the state parks system. Tours started that year, and we've been conducting them with a dedicated corps of volunteers regularly in the spring and the fall since then. Our goal will be to try to get you to imagine how this place functioned as an Indian village site 200 or 300 years ago. And the name Tomo-Kahni was suggested by our late elder Andy Green. Tomo-Kahni means winter home in the Kawayasu language. Now the Kawayasu, their name for themselves was Nuwa. The Kawayasu are of Shoshonean stock. They migrated to this area from the Great Basin, and they have no migration tails, and that's an indication that they've been here a long time. If you ask them how long they've been here, they say they've been here forever. They speak the southernmost Numic division of the Uto-Aztecan language. They lived in permanent villages in their core area. Their core area extended from here to the north to the Kern River, where the neighbors were the Tubatl-Atl. To the west, to the foothills of the San Joaquin Valley, their neighbors there were the Yokuts. To the south, to the Tehachapi Mountains, where their neighbors there were the Ketawnamuk. To the east, they were a desert people, mountain and desert people, and they extended to great portions of the Mojave Desert, and their neighbors there were the Koso and the Chemehuevi. Now, this is one of the permanent villages, and it's estimated that at one point, that generally there were about 80 inhabitants of this village. They were hunters and gatherers, a peaceful people. They went out seasonally to gather the resources, gather food, tools, reeds for making baskets, and also they went out for trade. From this area, there were a number of trails that went to various parts over which they would go out to trade, and other traders from other groups would come into this area. I think we're ready to head off, but there are a couple of things I want to bring to your attention. Please stay on the trail as we go up along the tour. We will be climbing. It's a moderate climb. Anybody in fairly good health should be able to make it. Please have water. Make sure that you have water with you. The duration of the tour will be about 3 hours. Now, this park comprises of about 470 acres, and we will be walking about 2.5 miles. It's a violation of rules and regulations and laws that we take anything from the park site, whether it's vegetable matter or minerals or rocks, artifacts of any kind. I think we're ready to move on, so let's go. The archaeological evidence indicates that the Kawayasu have been here about 1,500 years. How late did they live in this area? Andy Green, our late elder, was a young man living with his grandmother at Nettle Springs, who we'll be pointing out shortly, well into the 1920s. And they were not the only families living here. So they lived well into the 20th century. The first European contact with the Kawayasu was made by Franciscan Father Garces, who came to here in 1776 with a couple of Mojave guides. They stayed with the Kawayasu one night, and his journals indicate that he spent a night with them. In the village there were women and children. All the men were out hunting. He said that they were very cordial to him. They provided him and his guides meals, and he described the women as a robust lot. I think we're ready to move on, so onward. Here again, we'll stop for a few moments to catch our breaths and to talk about other aspects of the Kawayasu culture. Not a lot has been written about the Kawayasu in terms of anthropological and archaeological work, But the bulk of the work was done by Dr. Maurice Sigmund. In the 1930s, he was here and spent some time with the Kawayasu and was here for a couple of years, and he interviewed a lot of informants and got a lot of information from them. But he suddenly left and the work was unfinished. In the 70s, local members of the Heritage League contacted him and urged him to come back to Tehachapi and to finish his work. And he did that in the 1970s. Now, since there was a long span of time between the 30s and the 70s, many of his informants had died, but some of them still remained. Now, he was able to work with them, and he did finish some works that are very valuable for our knowledge about the Kawayasu culture. One of them was the ethnobotany of the Kawayasu group. Now, he was an ethnobotanist, but he did write about their culture. One of the things that he found in talking to his informants was that they used about 230 different plants, and he recorded their uses of them. Now, the uses of these plants included tools, food items, medicinal items, and for ritual items. One of them was the juniper tree that we find very abundantly here in Tomo-Kahni. This one is a female that has the berries. Now, the berries were a food item, and they were used extensively by the Kawayasu, among many other berries and plants and seeds that they would harvest on their seasonal rounds to the various areas that they exploited. Now, the branches were used to form the counties, their houses, and also they used them at times to make bows. They made a musical instrument from it. It would be a clapper that was from a branch from the juniper. They would split at the top and maybe put a wrapping around the handle part, and they would beat it on their hands in order to make a percussion sound that they used during their dances and singing. In terms of clothing, children didn't wear any clothing at all, and the women used a skirt that was made out of an animal hide, and sometimes, according to Zygmunt, they would use the bark of the juniper tree and make a skirt that they would wear. Men would wear a loincloth. For wintertime, they made a cloak made of rabbit skins. Now, they would gather intertribally with other groups. If they went into the San Joaquin Valley with the Yokuts and maybe the Katanamak also were their neighbors in the desert in the Antelope Valley, and they would have intertribal groups with them, and they would have rabbit drives. Now, one of the groups would provide a net, and they would string it out, and there would be beaters that would drive rabbits towards that net. There would be men along those nets, and as the rabbits came in, they would club them to death. Now, the rabbits provided food, and also they skinned the rabbits and cured the pelts, and then they would cut them in a manner that when they were finished cutting it out, it would be like a long thong or cord. Now, they would wind these so that there would be fur on all sides, and then sew them together and make a cloak out of them. It would be a cloak or a blanket. Now, for a grown man, it would probably take about 150, 170 rabbit skins in order to make a cloak. Naturally, for a child or for a woman, it would be less. I think we're ready to move on. Here we find a metate. This was used for grinding and processing seeds and other food items. We find these all over the park. There are many, many all over the park. And the technology was, in order to grind on this, you would use a hand stone called a mano, just for grinding in this manner. And the technology for this was metate and mano, and for the mortars it was pestle and mortar. Now, as I say, you found these all over the place, and we'll see a few more as we go along on our hike. This site is known as Nettle Springs, and it's identified that way on some maps. We'll be talking about the nettles in a few moments when we go on further down the trail. But every village site requires a source of water, and there was a spring-fed creek that ran right below us here for years and years and years, maybe hundreds of years. And old-timers say that when the earthquakes hit this area in 1952, the water went underground. So we don't see any more surface water, though at times during rainy seasons we have seen some water on the surface in the creek. We have a big willow tree here, and the willow tree was a resource. Now, the willow tree was used, the branches could be used for the framework of the Kahnis. The bark has medicinal qualities. The bark has an aspirin quality to it and was used as a tea for pain. And Andy Green related that this willow tree was a small tree when he lived here as a child with his grandmother. When he lived here with his grandmother, they lived in a Kahni that's just above us here, and that's where the bulk of the Kahnis were, and there are a lot of rock rings, which is all that remains of the Kahnis that were used in previous times. If this village consisted of about 80 to 100 people, there was probably from 16 to 17 or 18 Kahnis here at any given time. There are many people that have the impression that because this site is called Tomo-Kahni, which means winter home, that the village was occupied only in the winter time. Well, most of the Kawayasu of this village were probably here during most of the winter, because there's not a lot to do in the winter time. It was a time to tell stories, a time to maybe make projectile points and make tools, work on cloaks and work on their baskets. But during the rest of the year, they were probably coming and going, and there was probably always somebody here. Maybe the infirm or the old, they were probably always here. There was always somebody here, but in accordance with the seasons and the exploitation of the resources, they would be going to various places and then returning. Now, behind me, you'll see a sandstone ledge that's covered with bedrock mortars. The archaeological dig by Antelope Valley College in 70 and 71 plotted out over 400 bedrock mortars here. Now, why were there so many? The village comprised of maybe from 80 to 100 people. It's thought that families had a number of mortars assigned to them for different kinds of items, some for meat, some for this vegetable matter, some for the acorns. And when families passed away, individuals passed away, sometimes they left those mortars without being used. The acorns were harvested in the fall, August and September, and they gathered great quantities of them in burden baskets, and they processed them by letting them dry for a while, and then they were brought to the village site and stored in granaries. The acorns had to be shelled, and then they were pounded into a fine flour in these bedrock mortars with a pestle. And it was a long process. Now, once the acorns were pounded into a fine meal or flour, the meal had to be leached. The meal contains tannic acid, and that had to be removed before it was eaten. Then they had to cook it. So how did they cook? Well, they were fine basket makers, and they made baskets that could hold water. Their baskets were twined and twilled, and they would get water in the baskets, put the meal in it. But how did they cook it in a basket? You couldn't put a basket over a fire. So they found a way to cook in them, and they used stones. Well, maybe sister was over here tending a fire and heating stones, and a certain stone had to be used because some stones contain moisture, and as they're heated, they tend to explode. So they knew the kind of stone to get. Maybe mother would be over here tending the basket with the meal in it. She might add some meat, some rabbit or other animal meat into it if it was available, and she would use wild onions and maybe juniper berries in order to provide some flavoring for the meal. And then the sister, when the stone was hot enough, would have tongs or a branch with a hook on the end of it that they were able to get the stones with, and they would rinse them in water and then put them into the basket. Now, they had to keep moving the stones in the basket because if they were left to settle, they would burn a hole in the basket. Now, sometimes in museums, you'll see that some of the baskets are scorched a little bit because they didn't move the stones enough in order to keep the basket from burning. So they ate a lot of acorns. Now, another way of providing meat for the family, not only did the hunters hunt with throwing sticks and bows and arrows, but they had snares and deadfall traps. You've probably seen, if you're a Boy Scout especially, you've probably seen a method by which you would get a stone and stand it up and prop it up and have another little triggering mechanism. If a rabbit or squirrel or some animal passed by, it would fall and it would capture it there or kill it and use it for their diet. Well, we talk about the culture that the Kawayasu enjoyed in this habitat at this village site, but not too much is said about what's happened to them. If there were 400 Kawayasu at the time of Columbus, where are they now? Well, when the Europeans started coming into this area, generally they just started passing through. But in the 1850s, they started to settle. And more after the mines moved from the Mother Lode area in Northern California to the Kern River area, more and more people started coming. Some of them, rather than mining, started taking up the land and farming. Well, this disrupted the way of life of the Kawayasu. The lands that they exploited were now fenced off. They were being farmed, and if they approached them, they were run off by the Europeans, and there were some conflicts. So as they could no longer live the way that they had lived for centuries, they started taking up jobs as cowboys, working for Europeans on the farms and in the mines, and doing other things. At this point, there are very few full-blooded Kawayasu remaining, maybe just a handful. Now we'll move over to the nettles. These are the nettles of Nettle Springs. But Sigmund records from his informants that the nettle was a food item, medicinal item, and also a tool. Cordage could be made of the branches before they dried completely. They took them and they worked them and made cordage. And some of the nets used in the rabbit drives may have been made out of this cordage. Now, the nettles, when taken when they're tender and young, could be cooked and eaten as a resource. From here we're moving to another real interesting site. Follow me. At this site, we see on this sandstone strata a number of what we refer to as slash marks, just lines that have been carved into the sandstone. There's been some red ochre painted over some of them, and over here it looks like something black might have been used, or maybe it's a mineral that seeped in, but it could be some sort of painting. And people have wondered what they are, what they represent. The oral tradition from Andy Green, our late elder, is that he remembers his grandmother sitting in this area with other women while they worked on their baskets. He said that from time to time they would reach over and they would sharpen their awls. But these lines are found in other parts of California. That may have something to do with female puberty and fertility rites. It looks like they may have been counting something, but we can't really explain their nature and their purpose. In that direction, there's a little cave referred to as Wizard Cave and Healing Cave, and the oral traditions are that the ill were placed up there in that cave for recuperation. Now the cave is not very deep. It goes in about 7 or 8 feet. It's only about 5 feet wide, and to stand in it, you have to be stooped over. There is residue of paintings on the wall and some very shallow bedrock mortars on its floor. Sometimes these real shallow bedrock mortars are referred to as cupules. On its right-hand side, just a little lower than the mouth of the cave, you can see a tree there. It's easy to distinguish from the junipers that grow around it, but that tree is identified as a silk tassel tree. It has quinine properties to it, and we don't know whether it was here during ancient times or not. From here we're moving on to the site of a good example of a rock ring, and if you're ready, just follow me. Tomo-Kahni means winter home. Kahni is the word for home or house. All that remains of their kahnis at this point are scattered rocks like this, rock rings. In the archaeological dig of 70 and 71, they described how they were constructed, and they dug it out and found Now, these were substantial houses for the Kawayasu. They weren't temporary shelters. They were made to last, as opposed to the little lean-tos that they made when they went from one place to another and they were camping. What they did is found a level section or leveled out a little section, and they dug into the ground maybe about a foot and leveled it off and packed it with mud. Now, then they constructed framework over it. The framework could be made of available materials. In this area we have a lot of juniper, and that may have been what they used most of the time. In this area we find a lot of rabbit brush, and it's possible that they covered it with rabbit brush. In other areas they might have used tule, where it was abundant, and maybe they used other materials here. And they constructed them in such a manner that rainwater would wick its way out. And as they finished up, they put a rock ring around it to hold it together, keep rodents out of it, and maybe in some cases channel the rainwater coming down the hill away from the interior of the Kahni. As we get up a little higher here by the petroglyph, we'll be able to see where most of the Kahnis were above the bedrock mortars and nettle springs. Now, in the archaeological digs, they examined some, and they found that Andy Green's grandmother's Kahni was about 25 feet across. Some of them were quite large. Another one was found to be about 50 feet across, and they thought that that might have been a community structure of some kind. But at this point, all that remains are scattered rocks like this. There are a number of them all around this area here, and bedrock mortars are found around here also. In fact, bedrock mortars are found all over this park. There's hundreds of them. From here we're moving to the petroglyphs, so be careful. This is our petroglyph. Tomo-Kahni is at sort of the juncture of the territories that include petroglyphs and pictographs. So in this park we have at least a couple of petroglyphs and a number of pictographs. Now this petroglyph is not very clear, and a couple of years ago it was damaged and defaced by somebody who tried to superimpose a thunderbird in this area right here. Depicted in it, and there are photographs that show a bighorn sheep, a dog, and two hunters. And here's one hunter. I think the other one was here. It's been sort of damaged. And depending on what they're holding as weapons will help date it. And some have suggested that they're holding atlatls, others spears, and others bows. Now, if they're holding atlatls, that means that it's a lot older, because the bows came late into this area. So it would be a petroglyph made in the late area as opposed to an early period of time. Well, with that, we'll move on now to Creation Cave. When we started the tours, we asked the Kawayasu elders what they expected of us when we went into the cave. They asked us to be respectful when we went into it. As we go into the cave, you'll see that there are a number of pictographs on all the walls of the cave, and you're free to look at them. We ask that you don't touch them. According to their oral tradition, if you were to touch the caves, you're going to go blind. Another thing that we do is we make an offering. Grizzly Bear is the guardian of the cave, and Andy Green related the story that his grandmother came into the cave one time, and she didn't make an offering, and a grizzly bear chased her out of the cave. And I have some acorn meal here. I'm going to make an offering for all of us. This cave is of religious significance to the Kawayasu. In their oral traditions, they say that this is where they were created, and there's a mortar hole here that marks that spot. Andy Green relates that when he was a young man, he would stand in this area here, and in order to see the paintings, he would have to look up. But as you can see, portions of the cave walls have fallen in and raised the floor here, and now we're just at eye level of the paintings. Now people will ask how these paintings were made and what they depict. It's not clear what they depict. There are anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figures and geometric designs, the meaning of which I have no expertise in discerning. Now, these paintings were made by grinding minerals like red ochre and vegetable matter, binding it with grease, and maybe also, besides coloring, the vegetable matter would provide a binding. They would take a twig or a little branch of some kind and rough up the end and create a little brush from that and apply them to the walls. Now, these are pictographs as opposed to petroglyphs, and they don't have the longevity of a petroglyph. So these may be several hundred years old, maybe not even that old. They do not last as long as petroglyphs. They can last thousands of years. Now, over the years, there have been archaeological digs here. There's a little sign over here that shows that the American Society of Archaeology conducted a dig here in 1956. As mentioned earlier, Antelope Valley Community College had an archaeological dig in 70 and 71, and the slides show that they dug up this entire floor area on 5-foot grids, and they found a number of artifacts. Also during that archaeological dig, they tore apart a rat's nest that was in this cave, and they found numerous artifacts, including basketry material, wooden materials, and some stone materials. This cave and this entire little hidden valley bowl area is a sacred site that's important to them religiously. Shamans generally conducted religious activities in this area, and the boys and girls both had passing of age puberty rites. I don't know whether those rites were conducted in this cave, but they were conducted here at Tomo-Kahni, and they used datura, as many other cultures did, to produce hallucinogenic effect. There are some unique snake figure motifs. In the alcove, there's geometric figures and concentric circle designs. There are some little figures here that you can see, one with sort of big eyes, and it's very faded. When we first started these tours about 20 years ago, there were 3 of them in line, but you can see just in the past 20 years how much they have deteriorated. And it probably won't be very long, just as a result of natural action, that these paintings will, or the most of them, are going to fade and not be recognizable from what they are now.
My name is Luther Garotto. I'm one of the elders of the Kauai Sioux tribe, also one of the fluent speakers of the Kauai Sioux tribe. Soon, Sanav Paganin Kevovan Puvan Paganin Much Oeneka Masatub Wahodub Paganin Win Tovan Sanav Sanap soon Patnag Wahodub Karanin Menin Inero Sanave Sanave Menin Sanape Ido Pakanin Sanav Ido Wat Han Pakanin Paganin Ido Sanap Menin Iga Sanave Sanave Sanap Menin Hansun Putsugudik Niaganinne Sanap Menin Nuh Putsugudik Niaganam Sanap Menin Inro Sanap Imivan Hoikwevanam Nuh Imiro Biggest Begudda Wen Karanen Tugibavid Sanap Menin Yot Hoikwevanine It's Nahainen Sanave Imivan Wunavanam Nuh Imiro Biggest Begudda Menin Sanap Yuat Hoikwevan Ivas Karavada Sanapsun Chippinin Wahodub Wen Pitagwinin Puvan Karanin Sanape Sanap Menin in the row Sanap No Tonavadume Sanap soon Tonanin Money Sanap Sakanek Moin No Tonavada Mikaway Moin Tonanin Sanap Sakanek Van Karanin Sanave No Tonavada Mikaway Nabin Mananin Oho Sakanek Nabin No Inivada Mikaway Nabin Manakwanek Sakanek Snahainen No Kivadume Soon Kinin Sanape Mane Sakan Wan Puvan Karanen Sanab Yuquinin.
Well, we've come to the end of the tour. I hope that you're not too tired, and I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. Please tell your friends about our tours in our park, and I hope that you have a better understanding of the Kauai Sioux culture.